one of the modern challenges that's coming up is children who have additional needs in their classroom, some of the challenges that the local authority's been facing and national policy issues around what I call kind of educational health and care plans for young people. But looking at the history of Bristol North West, we've got a bit of heritage about schools that provide support for children with additional needs, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Bristol has actually got one of the earliest blind schools, schools for blind children, which was established in 1793, which was really, really early. It moved after a couple of iterations to Henleys in the early 20th century, but kind of typically of kind of schools for special educational needs of that period, they were really limited to facilities for blind and deaf children, and those are kind of the roots of the modern institutions. Interestingly, they were always kind of charitable, set up by charitable organisations or sometimes philanthropic ventures. Their numbers kind of increased in the 19th century, but it wasn't until much later in the 19th century that responsibility was transferred to local authorities to provide some facilities to educate children with additional needs.
We have quite a lot of schools now across Bristol North West, whether King's Weston School or some of the more traditional schools for children who are blind or deaf. We have schools for people who could not be in mainstream education or have physical disabilities now. We've got quite a lot of them in my neck of the woods. Why did this first one start for children who were blind? What was the kind of driving force behind it?
I think quite simply probably because it was a need that was easily understood. So the variety of needs catered for these days is so much broader than it was in those early days, but blindness and deafness were conditions that were really, really easily understood, and so those were the first ones to kind of be addressed, and I think that's kind of the origin of where it all started.
And you said the school moved around a bit. Was that because they needed different kind of physical setups to cater for the children?
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a guessing game, that one, really. The first institution was within a disused Baptist chapel on Callow Hill Street, which is somewhere underneath Cabot Circus, and then it moved to a site on Lower Magdalen Street, which then became the eye hospital, and then it moved to a site which is now occupied by the Wills Memorial Building. So kind of an interesting path that it took. But the reasons why it moved aren't entirely clear. We know that when it was built in Henleys in the early 20th century, it was purpose built to provide kind of residential accommodation. It was a really grand building architecturally, and so that kind of was a signal of the fact that, you know, it was an important institution. It mattered, and it was doing an important function.
In terms of interesting architecture for schools, we've got the Grace House Steiner School, which is now St Christopher's. That was for slightly different purposes, right?
Yeah, so that was a school that was founded in 1945 by Catherine Grace as a school for children with learning difficulties, and her aim was to educate the uneducable, and then it initially occupied a 19th century villa on Westbury Park, and then Grace House, which is what we think of as being the Steiner School, was built in the grounds in 1966 to the designs of a local architect called Alec French. A really interesting building which was listed at grade 2 in 2019, I think. And what's one of the really interesting points about it is its design was intended to kind of mirror the pedagogic approach. So Steiner had this theory about, which it was called eurythmy, which was about kind of expressive movements being therapeutic, and the building itself is this series of geometric volumes, all of which have kind of a strong vertical emphasis which shifts in scale and gives the building kind of a visual rhythm, and so that was supposed to be an expression of his approach, of Steiner's approach.
And when these schools are being purpose-built for children with additional needs, presumably they weren't in mainstream education at that time. In more modern settings, children, if they are able to be, are encouraged to be in mainstream settings where they have additional teaching assistant supports or things in place. It was normal, was it, for children to be segregated into these specific schools?
It was really up until around the 1960s, and then the focus shifted a bit into trying to kind of assimilate children with special needs into mainstream education. But it was always the case initially because it was felt that children with special needs couldn't be educated in the mainstream because their demands were too high, and so it was felt to be unfair on the other children. some children were excluded from school because of health problems, like tuberculosis, for instance. And so one of the interesting things, or one of the interesting ways that was dealt with was by open air schools. So you had these schools set up, and there were a couple in Bristol that were almost like big barns with one side open so the wind could gush through and kind of give, kind of fortify these little children.
Gosh.